The town of Redemption Gap was a blister on the face of the earth, a place God had either forgotten or forsaken. Dust, fine as powdered bone, settled on everything, coating the unpainted buildings in a permanent shroud of beige. It filled the air, the lungs, and the silences between words. The sun was a hammer, beating down from a bleached white sky, cracking the very ground into a mosaic of thirst. The single muddy street was a testament to a creek that had given up long ago, leaving behind a dry wound that ran through the heart of the settlement. Buildings leaned against each other for support, their timbers warped and groaning like old men with bad backs. It was a town holding its breath, waiting for a rain that never came or a final gust of wind to blow it all away. In this place of slow decay lived Eleanor Whitlow. At 27, she carried the stillness of someone much older, her face a pale map of sorrows not yet spoken. She was a widow, a fact the town never let her forget, though the title felt too simple for the complex brand of her grief. Her husband, Daniel, had been gone for 2 years, his life snuffed out in what the town called a border raid, a quick, violent story that was easier to swallow than the truth. Since his death, Eleanor had become a ghost in her own life, surviving on the fringes of a community that watched her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Her days were spent in the steamy, lye-scented haze of the town laundry, a small shack behind the general store where the respectable women of Redemption Gap would never dream of setting foot. Here, surrounded by other people's dirt, she washed away the grime of the town for a few coins a day. Her hands were raw, the knuckles split and red from the scalding water and harsh soap, but she worked with a relentless, mechanical rhythm. The labor was a kind of penance, a way to exhaust her body so her mind would have no energy left to wander down the dark corridors of memory. But the work could not deafen her to the whispers. They followed her like her own shadow, curling in the steam, rustling in the street as she passed. "The Whitlow woman," they would say, their voices dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Cursed! She is—" It was a cruel legend, but one that had taken root in the town's dry soil. It started after Daniel died. The farmer, Mr. Abernathy, who offered to help plow her small, stubborn plot of land, fell from his own hayloft a week later, shattering his leg in 3 places. Then came the blacksmith, a kind man named Samuel, who offered to fix the broken hinge on her shack door. His forge caught fire that very night, a mysterious blaze that took half his shop with it. Even young Timothy, the general store owner's boy, who carried a sack of flour to her doorstep, was bitten by a rattlesnake the next day while fishing at the dry creek bed. 1 tragedy was a misfortune. 2, a coincidence. 3 was a pattern. The town, starved for drama and steeped in superstition, declared her a harbinger of ruin. Men who had once looked at her with kindness now averted their eyes. Women crossed the street to avoid her path, clutching their children's hands as if her very presence was a contagion. She was an outcast, isolated by a fear she had not created but was forced to carry. Into this crucible of dust and quiet cruelty rode Luke Callahan. He arrived not with a thunder of hooves, but with the weary plod of a man who had been in the saddle for too long. His horse, a sturdy buckskin, walked with its head low, as tired as its rider. Luke was a man made of straight lines and sharp angles, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. He moved with a stillness that was not entirely peaceful. It was the coiled quiet of a predator, or of a man who had learned that unnecessary movement was a waste of precious energy. He had recently been discharged from his service as a cavalry scout, a life that had stripped him down to the bone, leaving behind a quiet competence and a landscape of scars, both visible and not. The most obvious was a puckered, angry mark that peeked from the collar of his worn shirt, evidence of a wound that had never quite settled. He favored his left shoulder, a subtle, unconscious gesture that spoke of a deep and constant ache. But the deeper wounds were in his eyes. They held the flat, distant look of a man who had seen things he could not unsee, acts of violence that had etched themselves onto his soul. He had come to Redemption Gap for the same reasons most drifters did: work, food, and a place to sleep where he did not have to watch his own back. He sought nothing more than a temporary pause in a life that felt like a long, hard journey to nowhere in particular. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the only building in town that seemed to possess any life, its bat-wing doors sighing open and closed, releasing bursts of tinny piano music and rough laughter. Luke tied his horse to the hitching post, giving the animal a reassuring pat on the neck before scanning the street. His gaze was methodical, taking in the layout of the town, the faces of the few people milling about, the rooftops, the alleyways. It was the instinct of a scout, a habit of survival that had kept him alive in places far more dangerous than this sleepy, sun-baked town. Their first meeting happened by the well at the edge of town, where the slope began to climb toward the scattered, poorer shacks that clung to the hillside. Eleanor was struggling with a large wooden barrel, half filled with water, its weight threatening to pull her down the dusty incline. Her arms strained, the muscles in her back screaming in protest. The water sloshed, dark and precious, some of it spilling onto the thirsty ground. She gritted her teeth, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and tried to heave it up another few inches. The barrel slipped in her grasp, tipping precariously. A shadow fell over her. "Ma'am?" The voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. Eleanor looked up, startled, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stood there, tall and lean, his face obscured by the brim of a dusty hat. He was a stranger, and strangers were an unknown quantity, a potential threat. "Let me give you a hand with that," he said. It was not a question. Before she could protest, he moved, his actions economical and sure. He took the heavy barrel from her as if it weighed nothing, his large, calloused hands easily finding a grip on the wood. He righted it and, with a single, smooth motion, lifted it to his good shoulder, settling its weight with a faint grimace that was the only sign of the effort. Eleanor stood frozen, her arms tingling with the sudden release of the load. He was too close. She could smell the scent of horse and sweat and dust on him, a raw, masculine smell that felt both foreign and dangerous. She saw the weathered lines around his eyes, the dark stubble on his jaw, the hard set of his mouth. Her unease was a physical thing, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. Every man who had offered her help had paid a price. This man, a complete stranger, knew nothing of the curse that clung to her. He started up the slope, his worn boots kicking up little puffs of dust. "Which one is yours?" he asked, his voice neutral, expecting no more than a simple direction. She pointed with a trembling finger toward the small, dilapidated shack that stood apart from the others, as if it, too, were an outcast. "There." He nodded once and continued the climb without another word. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. He walked with a slight limp she had not noticed before, and he kept his left arm still at his side, the barrel balanced entirely on his right shoulder. He placed it carefully on the small porch beside her door, the wood thudding softly. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet his gaze. She wanted him to leave, to walk away before the town's bad luck could latch onto him. Luke Callahan merely touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. He looked at her for a moment, his gray eyes taking in her worn dress, her chapped hands, the faint tremor in her posture. He saw not a curse, but a woman trying to hold herself together against a world that was trying to pull her apart. He saw a flicker of something familiar in her haunted gaze, a reflection of the ghosts that walked beside him. Without another word, he turned and walked back down the slope, his long shadow trailing behind him. Eleanor watched him go, her hand pressed against her chest, her heart beating a frantic, frightened rhythm. That night, a raw, whiskey-fueled wind blew in from the saloon, It came in the form of 3 ranch hands from the big cattle operation north of town, men with more muscle than sense and a mean streak that sharpened with every drink. Their names were Jeb, Cole, and a younger one called Billy. They were bored and drunk, a dangerous combination in a town with too few diversions. Their laughter, loud and ugly, echoed in the night as they staggered up the hill toward Eleanor's shack. They had heard the stories about the cursed widow, and in their alcohol-addled minds, she was an easy target for their cruel sport. Luke had found shelter in a dilapidated barn not 50 yards from Eleanor's home. He had not found work yet, but the livery owner had allowed him to sleep in the hayloft in exchange for mucking out the stalls. He was not asleep. Sleep rarely came easy to him. He lay on his back in the scratchy hay, listening to the sounds of the night, his hand resting near the worn butt of the pistol holstered at his side. He heard them coming long before they reached her door, their clumsy footsteps and loud, slurred voices an obvious intrusion in the quiet dark. "Come on out, widow woman," Jeb shouted, his voice thick with liquor. "We just want to be neighborly." Their cackles were sharp and cruel. A heavy fist pounded on the thin wooden door. "Don't be shy now. We heard you're looking for some company." Inside, Eleanor was a statue carved from ice. She sat on her small cot, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. The sound of their fists on her door was the sound of a nightmare she had been living and reliving for 2 years. The splintering wood, the hateful voices, the suffocating terror. It was all coming back. Her breath hitched in her chest, a silent scream trapped in her throat. Another slam, and the wood of the door frame groaned in protest. "Open up, or we'll huff and we'll puff and we'll blow your little house down," Cole roared, followed by another round of drunken laughter. Luke was already moving. He dropped from the hayloft as silently as a cat, landing in a crouch on the packed earth floor. He did not draw his gun. A gunshot would bring the whole town, and he understood instinctively that this was a private kind of violence, one that needed to be met with something just as personal. He slipped out of the barn and into the moonless dark, a shadow moving against other shadows. The ranch hands were growing bolder, their assaults on the door becoming more violent. A hinge tore loose with a sharp shriek of metal. They were seconds from breaking it down completely. They never heard Luke approach. He came at them from the side, a phantom of vengeance. The first man, Jeb, went down without knowing what hit him. Luke's fist, hard as a river stone, connected with his jaw with a sickening crack. The man collapsed in a heap. Cole turned, his eyes wide with drunken confusion, and caught Luke's boot in his stomach. The air rushed out of him in a pained whoosh, and he doubled over, gagging. Luke grabbed him by the hair and slammed his face into the wall of the shack. Billy, the youngest, sobered instantly with fear. He fumbled for the pistol at his belt, but Luke was too fast. He lunged forward, grabbing the boy's wrist and twisting it until the bone snapped. The boy screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony, and the gun clattered to the ground. Luke hit him once, a hard, precise blow to the temple, and he crumpled beside the others. The fight was over in less than a minute. It was not a brawl. It was an execution of violence, swift and brutal and terribly efficient. 2 men lay groaning and bloodied in the dirt. The third was unconscious. Luke stood over them, his chest heaving, the adrenaline singing in his veins, the old, familiar rage, the one he carried with him from the war, burned hot in his gut. He looked at his own knuckles, split and bleeding, and felt a dull, hollow ache that had nothing to do with the pain. The noise had roused Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary expression suggested he had seen every kind of human ugliness the frontier had to offer. He appeared carrying a lantern, its yellow light casting long, dancing shadows. He took in the scene at a glance, the 3 broken men on the ground, the splintered door, and the silent, imposing figure of the stranger standing guard. "What in blazes happened here?" the sheriff asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "They were trying to break down her door," Luke said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The sheriff shone the lantern on the faces of the ranch hands, recognizing them instantly. He sighed, a long, tired sound. He prodded Jeb with the toe of his boot. The man moaned. "Get up," the sheriff ordered. "All of you, get out of here before I throw you in a cell to rot." Stumbling and groaning, the three men helped each other up and staggered away into the darkness, leaving behind the smell of cheap whiskey and blood. The sheriff turned his attention to Luke. He studied him for a long moment, his gaze sharp and appraising. "You the new fella?" Luke nodded. "I appreciate you handling this," the sheriff said, gesturing toward the broken door. "But I'm going to give you some free advice. Son, you'd do well to stay clear of that woman." "Why's that?" Luke asked, his voice still low. "Because she's trouble," the sheriff said plainly. "This town, it's got a long memory. The folks here, they despise her. They got their reasons, rightly or wrongly. You stand too close to her, and that trouble will find its way to you. It always does." He tipped his hat. "Just a warning." He then turned and walked away, his lantern light shrinking until it was swallowed by the night. Luke waited until the sheriff was gone before he approached the damaged door. He knocked softly, his bruised knuckles barely making a sound. "Ma'am, it's over. They're gone." A long silence followed. Then, the sound of a wooden bar being lifted. The door creaked open a few inches, and Eleanor's pale face appeared in the sliver of darkness. Her eyes were wide, her breathing still shallow and ragged. She looked at him, then at the dark stains on the ground where the men had fallen, and back to him. She opened the door wider, stepping back to let him in. The inside of the shack was sparse, almost bare. A small cot, a rickety table with a single candle, and a few crates for storage. It was clean, but it was the home of someone who owned next to nothing. The candle flame flickered, throwing their shadows against the rough-hewn walls, making them look like giants. She thanked him, her voice a hesitant whisper that trembled in the small space. She looked down at her own hands, clasped tightly in front of her. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, so quietly he almost did not hear her. "You don't understand. Pain always follows anyone who stands near me. It's a curse." She finally lifted her head, and her eyes, luminous in the candlelight, were filled with a profound and bottomless sorrow. Luke looked at her, at the fear and resignation warring in her expression. He saw the way she held herself, as if expecting a blow at any moment. The sheriff's warning echoed in his mind, but it meant nothing next to the raw, wounded humanity of the woman standing before him. He thought of the men he had killed, the friends he had watched die, the constant, grinding pain in his shoulder that was a physical reminder of all he had lost. The world had taken its pound of flesh from him, and then some. He met her gaze, and for the first time the hardness in his own eyes softened, replaced by a deep, weary understanding. "Maybe pain's all I've ever known," he replied, his voice a low rumble. Their eyes held in the flickering candlelight, locked in a moment that stretched into an eternity. The air grew heavy, charged with all the things they did not say, all the scars they did not show. In that shared glance, two broken people, strangers in a hostile world, recognized the shape of their own loneliness in each other. It was not hope that passed between them, not yet. It was something far more primal, the silent acknowledgement of a shared and terrible burden. The town of Redemption Gap settled into a state of silent hostility. Luke Callahan's act of violence had not made him a hero. It had marked him as an accomplice to the town's pariah. No one would offer him work. Doors that might have opened to a lone cowboy looking for a day's wage were now firmly shut. He became a second shadow to Eleanor, another ghost to be ignored and whispered about. Yet, he did not leave. He stayed, a stubborn rock against which the town's silent tide of disapproval broke and receded. He found work, of a sort, with a man named Henderson, a rancher on the far edge of the territory who cared more for a straight fence line than for town gossip. The job was mending miles of wire that had been snapped by winter storms and wandering herds. It was solitary, back-breaking labor under the relentless sun, but it provided a few dollars and, more importantly, a reason to remain. He continued to live in the rundown barn, its splintered walls and leaky roof a marginal improvement over sleeping in the open. Its proximity to Eleanor's shack was a silent declaration he was not yet ready to make in words. An uneasy companionship began to form between them, woven from threads of necessity and shared isolation. It was a relationship built in silence. In the evenings, after a long day of stretching wire, he would find a plate of simple food, stew or beans with a piece of hard bread, left on a crate just inside the barn door. He never saw her leave it. In return, he repaired the door the ranch hands had broken, fitting the new hinges with a quiet efficiency that made the wood hang straighter than it ever had before. He patched the weak spots in her roof with salvaged shingles and reinforced the fence around her small, dusty yard. They were transactions of survival, gestures that spoke louder than any words they might have exchanged. They began to share quiet dinners. He would bring his plate from the barn and sit on the edge of her small porch while she sat in her doorway, the space between them charged with a tension that was part fear, part curiosity. The silences were long, punctuated only by the scrape of a spoon against a tin plate or the lonely cry of a coyote in the distant hills. They did not speak of the town, or of the night he had saved her. They spoke of the weather, the lack of rain, the stubbornness of the soil. Their conversations were like two people feeling their way through a dark room, hands outstretched, terrified of bumping into something sharp. In these quiet hours, Luke watched her, his scout's eyes, trained to notice every broken twig and disturbed patch of earth, now cataloged the geography of her pain. He saw the way she flinched whenever a horse galloped suddenly down the street, her body tensing as if bracing for a gunshot. He noticed she would never enter the dark, windowless shed behind her shack to retrieve firewood until the sun was high in the sky, always leaving the door wide open. When she sat, she always chose a chair that faced the entrance, her back to a solid wall. The trauma of past violence was not just a memory for her. It was a living thing, a phantom that shaped her every gesture, a constant, silent scream behind her eyes. One evening in late summer, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The air grew thick and heavy, the stillness unnatural. Clouds boiled up on the horizon, dark and menacing, and a low rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. As dusk fell, the storm broke with a primal fury. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the dust to a thick, running mud. Lightning tore jagged scars across the sky, followed moments later by cracks of thunder so violent they seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Luke sat in the barn, watching the storm through the gaps in the wallboards. Each flash of lightning illuminated the world in a stark, momentary photograph of silver and black. He thought of the war, of nights spent on picket duty, the sky erupting with artillery fire that looked and sounded just like this. He was accustomed to the noise, to the feeling of the world coming apart at the seams. Then he heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the storm, a raw, terrified scream. It was not a shout for help, but a sound of pure, unadulterated horror, wrenched from the deepest part of a soul. It was Eleanor. He was out of the barn and running before he had time to think, the cold rain plastering his shirt to his skin. He did not bother with her door, which he knew would be barred. He went to the small, single window at the side of her shack. It was shuttered but not latched. He pried it open and hauled himself through, landing silently on the floor of her small room. In the near total darkness, broken by the strobing flashes of lightning, he saw her. She was sitting bolt upright on her cot, her hands clenched in the thin blanket, her eyes wide and unseeing. She was trapped in a nightmare, her body rigid with a terror that was not of the storm, but of a memory the storm had unlocked. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and calm. She screamed again, a choked, desperate sound, Another flash of lightning lit the room, and in that brief, brilliant moment, he saw the sheen of sweat on her forehead and the stark terror on her face. He moved toward her slowly, his hands held out where she could see them. "It's just me. It's Luke," he said, keeping his voice steady. "It's just the storm." She was trembling violently, her whole body shaking with the force of her fear. He reached her cot and knelt beside it. He did not touch her at first, not wanting to startle her further. He simply stayed there, a solid, calming presence in the chaos. "You're safe," he said. "I'm here." Her wild eyes finally seemed to focus on him. She was breathing in short, shallow gasps, as if she could not get enough air. He slowly reached out and took her hands. They were ice cold and clenched into tight fists. He did not try to pry them open. He simply held them, his large, warm hands enclosing hers, offering a steady anchor in the tempest of her memory. He held on as another peal of thunder shook the shack, and he felt the jolt of fear that went through her. He just held tighter. Minutes passed. The storm raged outside, and a smaller, more terrible storm slowly subsided within her. Her trembling lessened. Her breathing deepened. The rigidity left her body, replaced by a profound, boneless exhaustion. She slumped forward, her head bowed, her hands still enclosed in his. The tears came then, silent and hot, falling onto their joined hands. "It wasn't raiders," she whispered, her voice broken and raw. "My Daniel, he wasn't killed by raiders." Luke remained silent, listening. He knew this was a dam that had been holding back years of poisoned water, and it was finally breaking. "It was them," she choked out. "The men from the saloon, their kind, ranch hands from the Morton outfit. They came in the night just like this. There was shouting and fire." Her voice trailed off, lost in the memory. She took a ragged breath and continued, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if she had to say them now, or she would never say them at all. "They accused him of stealing cattle, Silas Morton's cattle, but Daniel never stole a thing in his life. He was a good man, the most honest man I ever knew. But Morton wanted our land. The creek still ran on it then. He made up the lie. And the men, they were happy to believe it. They dragged him from this house." She was shaking again, but she did not pull her hands away from his. His steady grip was the only thing keeping her from flying apart. "They had torches and guns. It was just like the lightning and the thunder. I tried to stop them. I begged them, but they threw me to the ground. They lynched him, right there, from the big cottonwood tree down by the dry creek. They made me watch." The confession hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. It explained everything, her fear of the dark, her flinching at loud noises, the town's cruel and complicit silence. They had not just allowed an innocent man to be murdered, they had participated in it with their silence, and they had turned their guilt into hatred for the one person who served as a constant reminder of their sin. A cold, quiet rage began to burn in Luke's chest. It was a familiar feeling, an old companion from his days as a scout, when he had seen the ugliest parts of human nature laid bare. He pictured the men from the other night, their smug, drunken faces. He thought of their hands, and what they had done. His first instinct was a primal urge for retribution, a desire to take his gun and his knife and repay violence with violence. But he pushed it down. He had seen where that path led. He knew that vengeance in a land like this only ever watered the ground for more graves. It solved nothing. It just created more ghosts. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it held the weight of iron. "I'm sorry. Eleanor, I'm truly sorry." They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the dark while the storm slowly spent its fury and moved on. Her tears subsided, leaving behind a fragile, exhausted calm. The confession, though agonizing, had lanced a wound that had been festering for 2 years. For the first time, she had shared the weight of her truth with another living soul, and he had not run. In the days that followed, the space between them changed. The unspoken truth was now a shared secret, a foundation upon which something new and tentative began to be built. The long silences were no longer filled with tension, but with a quiet understanding. They began to work side by side, falling into a natural rhythm. When he decided to fix her dilapidated roof for good, she was there, handing him shingles and nails, her presence a steady counterpoint to his labor. When he set about mending the fences around her property, she worked with him, pulling the wire taut while he hammered in the staples. They cooked their meals together over her small stove, moving around each other in the cramped space with an unpracticed grace. The walls of their individual prisons, built from pain and loneliness, were beginning to crack. Through the shared sweat of their labor, they were learning the language of each other's movements, the rhythm of each other's breath. He learned the determined set of her jaw when she was focused on a task. She learned the way he would subtly shift his weight off his bad shoulder when he thought no one was watching. One night, as they sat on the porch, watching the last vestiges of sunlight bleed from the sky, the air was cool and clean after the storm. The world felt quiet, peaceful, but peace was a foreign country to them both. "Luke?" she asked softly, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "Does the pain ever leave? The memory of it?" He was quiet for a long moment. Considering the question, he thought of the faces of men he had killed, the feeling of the ground trembling from a cavalry charge, the constant, dull throb in his shoulder. He did not offer her a lie or an easy comfort. He gave her the only thing he had, the truth. "No," he answered, his voice a low murmur. "I don't think it ever really leaves. It becomes a part of you, like a scar." He paused, turning to look at her in the gathering dusk. "But sometimes it becomes something we can share, and that makes it lighter to carry." Her eyes met his, and in their depths, he saw a flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a step away from despair. Their first kiss happened a few days later, not in a moment of passion, but in a moment of profound exhaustion. They had spent the entire day digging a new irrigation ditch from the well to her small, struggling garden, a desperate attempt to coax some life from the parched soil. The work was brutal. By the time the sun began to set, they were both covered in dirt and sweat, their muscles aching with a deep, satisfying weariness. They sat on the ground, leaning back against the wall of the shack, too tired to move. Eleanor passed him a dipper of water, and their fingers brushed. The contact was electric, a small spark in the vast, quiet landscape of their lives. He watched as a drop of water trickled from the corner of her mouth and down her chin, tracing a clean path through the grime on her skin. He did not know who moved first. It was a mutual, unspoken surrender. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not soft or gentle. It was clumsy and desperate, chapped lips meeting in a raw collision of need and sorrow. It tasted of dust and sweat and the metallic tang of shared exhaustion. It was a frantic clinging to something that felt alive, a defiant gesture against a world that had tried to bury them both. It was the kiss of two survivors, finding a moment of fragile sanctuary in each other. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. The air between them was thick with a new, terrifying intimacy. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes dark and searching in the twilight. She was trembling, not from cold or fear, but from the shock of feeling something other than pain. Letting him in, letting anyone in, felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. It was a risk that could lead to a final, devastating fall. But the thought of turning back, of returning to the absolute solitude of her grief, was even more terrifying. She reached up and touched his rough, unshaven cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, a surrender to the perilous, uncharted territory they had just entered. "Don't stop," she breathed, the words heavy with the weight of her past and the fear of her future. "Even if it hurts." The quiet understanding that had grown between Eleanor and Luke was a fragile seedling in a barren land, and the town of Redemption Gap was determined to see it withered. Their shared solitude was a mystery the townsfolk could not tolerate, and so they filled the space with the ugliest words they could find. The whispers that had once called Eleanor cursed now took on a sharper, more venomous edge. She was no longer just a harbinger of misfortune. She was a fallen woman. The man who had stayed by her side was not a protector, but a partner in her disgrace. Rumors, once they take root in a small town, spread faster than prairie fire. They travel on the glances exchanged over cracker barrels in the general store, in the sudden silences that fall when Eleanor entered a room, in the way other women gathered their skirts a little closer as she passed. The words themselves were rarely spoken directly to her, but she felt them like stones thrown from the shadows. "Living in sin," they hissed, the widow and the ex-soldier, shacked up in the shadow of her dead husband's memory. The town's collective guilt over Daniel Whitlow's death had found a new, more convenient target. It was easier to condemn the living than to repent for the dead. The first open blow came from the self-appointed guardian of the town's morality, the pastor's wife, a stern, thin-lipped woman named Beatrice Gable. She confronted Eleanor outside the laundry, where Eleanor had just picked up her meager weekly wages from its owner, Mr. Finch, Mrs. Gable stood squarely in her path, her Bible clutched to her chest like a shield. "Eleanor Whitlow," she said, her voice loud enough for the men loitering on the saloon porch across the street to hear. "You have become a shame upon the decent womenfolk of this town. Your behavior is an affront to the memory of your husband and an offense in the eyes of the Lord." Eleanor froze, the coins in her hand suddenly feeling cold and heavy, her face flushed with a hot, spreading shame. She tried to step around the woman, but Mrs. Gable moved to block her again. "We have all tried to show you Christian charity in your time of grief," the woman continued, her voice rising with a self-righteous fervor. "But to take up with a violent drifter, to live in such a flagrant state of impropriety, it is an infection. We will not have it here." Eleanor could feel the eyes of the town on her, dissecting her, judging her. She could not find her voice to defend herself. What could she say? How could she explain a bond forged in pain to a woman who only understood the rigid lines of Scripture? She lowered her head, the brim of her bonnet hiding her face, and pushed past Mrs. Gable, half running back toward the lonely shack on the hill. The next blow fell the following morning. When she arrived at the laundry, Mr. Finch was waiting for her, his face a mask of anxious discomfort. He was a small, timid man who feared his wife and public opinion more than he feared God. "Eleanor, I'm sorry," he stammered, avoiding her eyes. "I have to let you go." "What?" The word was a small, breathless sound. "But why? I do good work. I'm always on time." "It's not the work," he said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "It's the talk. My wife, Mrs. Gable, and the other ladies. They say they'll take their custom elsewhere if you continue to work here. I have a family to feed. Eleanor, I can't afford to lose their business." And just like that, her last tether to the town, her only means of survival, was cut. She walked away from the laundry, the familiar smell of lye and steam now a scent of rejection, and did not look back. When Luke returned from a long day of mending fences, he found her sitting on the porch, her hands idle in her lap, her gaze fixed on the dusty street below. He knew instantly that something was wrong. The stillness in her was different. It was the stillness of defeat. She told him what had happened, her voice flat and emotionless, as if she were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. As he listened, the quiet rage that lived just beneath his skin began to stir. He saw the deep humiliation she was trying to hide, and it felt like a physical blow. He had spent his life watching the strong prey on the weak, and he was sick of it. That evening, he went to the saloon. He was not looking for a drink. He was looking for a fight. He did not have to wait long. He stood at the bar, nursing a single glass of whiskey, his presence a silent challenge. The same men who had watched Eleanor's public shaming were there, including Cole, one of the ranch hands he had beaten. Cole saw him, and a slow, malicious grin spread across his face. "Well, look what we have here," Cole said loudly to his companions. "If it ain't the cursed widow's new stud horse, tell me, Callahan, is she as free with her favors for you as she was for her husband before Morton's rope shut his lion mouth?" The saloon went quiet. Luke turned slowly, his gray eyes as cold as a winter river. "You'll take that back," he said, his voice dangerously low. Cole laughed. "I ain't taking back the truth. Everyone knows she's a—" He never finished the word. Luke crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, and his fist connected with Cole's mouth, splitting his lip and sending a spray of blood and whiskey into the air. The room exploded into chaos. Men shouted. Chairs were overturned. Luke moved with a focused, brutal efficiency, the skills of a soldier unleashed in the confines of a barroom. He fought not with the wild flailing of a drunk, but with a cold, precise violence that was far more terrifying. He broke a man's nose, threw another through the bat-wing doors, and left Cole on the floor, groaning and clutching his ribs. By the time Sheriff Brody arrived, Luke was standing alone amidst the wreckage, his knuckles bleeding, his chest heaving. The sheriff looked at him, then at the groaning men, and his weary face sagged even further. He did not arrest Luke. He just pointed a thumb toward the door. "Get out, Callahan, and don't come back. You just made things a whole lot worse for yourself. And for her." Luke walked back to the shack, the fury slowly draining out of him, leaving behind the familiar, hollow ache. He had not defended her honor. He had only proven the town right. He was a violent man, and by associating with him, Eleanor was now guilty by proximity. The fight, however, did not drive them apart. It did the opposite. With the entire town now set against them, they turned inward, finding their only refuge in each other. They were an island of 2 in a sea of hatred. The world shrank until it was just the dusty shack, the dilapidated barn, and the small patch of stubborn ground that connected them. In the quiet evenings, they began to talk of leaving. It was a fragile dream, whispered in the dark. "We could go north," Luke said one night, tracing a map on the dusty table with his finger. "Up to Montana territory. Big country up there. A person can get lost. Start over." "Start over." Eleanor repeated the words softly, as if they were from a foreign language. The idea was both terrifying and intoxicating. To be somewhere where no one knew her name, where her past was not a brand on her skin. "Could we, Luke? Could we really?" "We could," he said, his voice certain. "Just need to save a little money. Enough for a wagon and supplies. We can do it." The dream became their secret gospel, a promise of a future that sustained them through the hungry days that followed. With her job gone, they lived on the meager wages he earned from his fence work and what little they could grow in their garden. One afternoon, a peddler's wagon rattled into town, a rolling emporium of goods from the east. It was a rare event, and the women of the town gathered around it, their voices bright with excitement. Eleanor watched from her porch, a silent observer to a life she was no longer part of. Luke saw her watching, saw the flicker of longing in her eyes. He walked down to the wagon. With a handful of coins he had carefully saved, he bought a dress. It was not new. It was a second-hand garment of dark blue calico, slightly faded but well made, with small, pearl-like buttons running down the front. He brought it back to her, holding it out awkwardly in his large, calloused hands. "I saw this," he said, his voice gruff with embarrassment. "I thought it might suit you." Eleanor stared at the dress. It had been years since she had owned anything that was not purely functional. Years since anyone had looked at her and seen a woman who might wear a pretty dress. It was such a small gesture, but it was everything. It was a declaration that he saw her, Eleanor, not the cursed widow, not the town's disgrace, but a woman worthy of a small piece of beauty. She took the dress, the soft, worn fabric cool against her skin, and silent tears began to trace paths through the dust on her cheeks. She did not weep for sorrow, but for a crack of light that had just broken through her long, dark night. But in Redemption Gap, every moment of light was inevitably followed by a deeper darkness. The ranch hands Luke had fought nursed their grudges along with their bruises. Their humiliation festered, turning into a need for a more permanent kind of revenge. They came late one night, moving with a stealth they had not possessed when they were drunk. There were 3 of them, shadows slipping through the darkness, their faces hardened by malice. They were not aiming for Eleanor's shack this time. Their target was the barn where Luke slept. They carried tins of kerosene and a burning hatred. Eleanor was woken by a strange, flickering light. At first, she thought it was a trick of the moon, but then she smelled it, the sharp, acrid scent of smoke. She shot up from her cot and looked out the window. Her heart stopped. The barn was on fire. Flames, orange and red, were already licking up the dry timber walls, crawling toward the roof of the hayloft where he slept. A scream tore from her throat. "Luke!" There was no time for thought, no time for fear. She threw open her door and ran barefoot into the night, the sharp stones and thistles of the yard tearing at the soles of her feet. The heat from the fire was a physical blow, a scorching wave that made her skin prickle. The roar of the flames was a living, hungry sound. "Luke!" she screamed again, her voice raw with terror. "Wake up!" She reached the massive barn doors, the wood already hot to the touch. She clawed at them, pulling with all her strength. Inside, the fire was a maelstrom of smoke and swirling embers. She could see the flames climbing the ladder to the loft. He was trapped. Just then, a figure appeared at the edge of the loft, silhouetted against the inferno. It was Luke, awake and moving, but disoriented by the thick, choking smoke. He staggered toward the ladder, but a burning rafter crashed down, blocking his path. "The window!" Eleanor shrieked, pointing to the small hay window at the front of the loft. "Jump!" He saw her then, her face a pale oval of terror in the demonic light of the fire. He scrambled toward the window, coughing violently, his lungs filling with poison. He threw himself through the opening, landing hard on the ground below in a shower of sparks and hay. Eleanor rushed to him, heedless of the embers that singed her nightgown and hair. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch him. He was alive, but he was coughing uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. His shirt was scorched, and angry red burns were already starting to blister on his arms and one side of his face. She grabbed him, pulling him away from the collapsing structure, her small frame straining with the effort. The roof of the barn gave way with a deafening roar, sending a geyser of sparks and flames into the black sky. They collapsed together in the dirt, a safe distance away, lying in the ashes and cinders that rained down around them. He lay in her arms, coughing, his body trembling with shock and pain. She held him tightly, her face buried in his smoke-filled hair, her tears mixing with the soot on his skin. All her carefully constructed walls, all her fears of the pain that love might bring, were incinerated in the heat of that fire. The only thing she knew was the terrifying, absolute certainty that she could not live without him. "I can't lose you too," she sobbed, the words torn from the deepest part of her. "I can't bear it." Luke reached up with a burned hand and touched her face, his thumb smearing a track of soot and tears on her cheek. He looked at her, his smoke-raw eyes filled with an agonizing tenderness. "Pain makes us one," he rasped, his voice a broken whisper. "And if it does, I'll take it." They did not speak of leaving after that. He was too injured to travel, and a stubborn, defiant resolve had taken root in them. The town had tried to burn them out, to destroy them. They would not give it the satisfaction of seeing them run. The barn was a skeleton of charred timbers and ash, but it was all they had. Together, they began to rebuild. They salvaged the boards that were not completely burned, pulling them from the wreckage, their hands becoming black with soot. They cleared the debris, creating a small, livable space within the blackened shell of the old structure. They patched the gaping holes in the roof with pieces of tin and oiled canvas. It was a crude, ugly shelter, but it was theirs. It was the first home they had ever shared. Their love, forged in the crucible of that fire, grew quieter. It was not a bright, dazzling flame that risked burning itself out. It was a small, steady ember that glowed in the heart of the ashes. It was the quiet way she tended to his burns, her touch gentle and sure. It was the way he would watch her as she slept, his heart aching with a fierce, protective feeling he had never known before. They had been brought together by pain and violence, and now, in the ruins of an attempt to tear them apart, they clung to each other, their shared survival a testament to a love that was not soft or easy, but enduring, like the scarred and stubborn landscape they called home. Sheriff Brody's investigation into the barn fire was as thin and fleeting as the smoke that had stained the morning sky. He rode out, kicked at a few charred timbers, and asked a handful of questions around town that were met with shrugs and averted gazes. Redemption Gap had closed ranks, its silence a thick, impenetrable wall. The sheriff was a man who understood the delicate arithmetic of power in a town like his. Silas Morton owned the largest ranch, employed the most men, and held the town's prosperity in his fist. Justice was a luxury he could not afford if it meant crossing a man like that. He found Luke clearing debris from the burned-out shell of the barn. "Find anything?" Luke asked, his voice flat, not bothering to look up from his work. His arms were still bandaged, the skin beneath tight and painful. "Nothing but ash," the sheriff replied, his tone weary. "No one saw anything. No one knows anything." He paused, then added, "You're a stubborn man, Callahan. Most fellas would have taken this as a sign to move on." "I'm not most fellas," Luke said, finally meeting the sheriff's gaze. His eyes were hard. "No, you're not," Brody agreed with a sigh, "and that's what's going to get you killed. Take my advice. The longer you stay, the worse it's going to get for you and that woman." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving them to the town's silent, simmering judgment. The sheriff's prediction proved true sooner than anyone expected. A few weeks later, as autumn began to bleed the color from the hills, a new rumor started. 20 head of cattle had gone missing from a neighboring ranch. It was a common enough problem: rustlers, bad fences, predators. But in the poisoned atmosphere of Redemption Gap, the blame needed a target, and the town had one ready. The whispers started in the saloon and spread to the general store, then to the sewing circles. Callahan, the violent outsider, the man who lived in sin with the cursed widow. He was a former scout. He knew how to move unseen. He was desperate for money. The logic was simple, damning, and completely false. It was the old lie, resurrected from Daniel Whitlow's grave and fitted to a new victim, for Eleanor. Hearing the whispers was like being trapped in a recurring nightmare. The same sideways glances, the same hushed conversations that stopped the moment she came near. It was the same poison that had killed her husband, and now it was seeping into the air around Luke. That evening, she found him sharpening his knife by the light of their small fire, his movements angry and precise. The muscles in his jaw were knotted tight. "You cannot," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "You cannot go into town. You cannot confront them." "They're calling me a thief, Eleanor," he said, the words a low growl. The same lie they used on him. "I won't let them do it again." "And what will you do?" she pleaded, her hands clenched at her sides. "Fight them all. You saw what happened in the saloon. Violence only proves their point. It gives them the excuse they want." Her eyes were wide with a desperate, remembered terror. "Please, Luke, they hung my husband. Do you think they would hesitate to do the same to you? Please, just let it be. We have our dream. The North. Let's hold on to that and ignore them." He looked at her, at the raw fear in her face, and the rage in his chest warred with the fierce, protective love he felt for her. She was right. Vengeance was a fool's game, a short path to a shallow grave. He slowly put the knife down, the fight going out of him, replaced by a cold, heavy feeling of helplessness. Their fragile peace was shattered a few days later by the arrival of a man who rode into town as if he owned it. His name was Silas Morton. He was in his 50s, with a rider's posture and a landowner's arrogance. His face was weathered, but his clothes were expensive. His silver-inlaid saddle a testament to a fortune built on the backs of other men. He was the architect of Eleanor's misery, the man who had ordered Daniel's death to secure the water rights to their land. He was in town to oversee a cattle sale, his presence casting a long, dark shadow over everything. Morton saw them in the street. He was coming out of the general store just as Eleanor and Luke were walking past. His eyes narrowed, first at Eleanor, then at the tall, scarred man beside her. He saw the way Luke stood, a silent guardian at her shoulder. He saw the defiance in Eleanor's posture, a strength that had not been there 2 years ago. Morton was a man who understood threats, and he recognized one immediately. The widow was no longer a broken, isolated creature. She had a protector, a man who looked like he knew how to kill. The truth of what he had done to her husband was a sleeping dog, and Morton saw that Luke Callahan was just the man to wake it up. The confrontation came that evening. Morton and his men were in the saloon, their voices loud and domineering. Luke and Eleanor had come into town for a sack of flour, intending to be as quick and invisible as possible, but as they passed the saloon, Morton's voice boomed out, deliberately cruel. "Well, I'll be," he said, stepping out onto the porch, a whiskey glass in his hand. "If it ain't the Whitlow woman. It's a shame your husband stretched a rope before he could teach you about keeping decent company." His men laughed, a chorus of mean, ugly sounds. Eleanor flinched as if struck. She tried to pull Luke away, her hand gripping his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Please, Luke, for me." But Luke was no longer listening. He gently removed her hand from his arm and turned to face Morton. He walked toward the saloon porch, his movements slow and deliberate. The laughter died. The street went silent. The whole town seemed to be watching. "You have something to say about this lady," Luke said, his voice calm but carrying the deadly weight of a coiled snake. "You say it to me." Morton's eyes glinted with arrogant amusement. He was not used to being challenged. "And who are you? Her new charity case?" He took a deliberate swallow of his whiskey. "Seems to me you're just another stray dog sniffing around another man's leftovers." Luke did not rise to the bait. He just stood there, his stillness more menacing than any threat. Morton, unnerved by this silent defiance and overconfident in his own power, made a fatal miscalculation. "Get out of my sight," Morton snarled, setting his glass down. His hand dropped to the pistol holstered at his hip. "Both of you." He drew the gun. The crowd gasped, but Morton was a rancher, not a gunman. His draw was slow and clumsy. Luke moved with the blinding speed of a man for whom violence was a second language. He closed the distance in a single step, his left hand clamping down on Morton's wrist, forcing the gun's barrel toward the sky. With his right hand, he delivered a short, sharp blow to the rancher's elbow. The bone gave with a wet pop. Morton screamed in pain and the gun clattered onto the wooden porch. Luke kicked it away. He stood over the powerful rancher, who was now cradling his broken arm, his face pale with shock and agony. Luke had not drawn his own weapon. He had won without a single gunshot. But as he looked around at the faces in the crowd, he saw no admiration, no relief. He saw only fear. They did not see a man defending a woman's honor. They saw a dangerous drifter who had just laid hands on the most powerful man in the county. In their eyes, Silas Morton was the victim. Luke Callahan was the villain. The town delivered its final judgment that night, as a cold wind began to blow from the north, carrying the first scent of winter. They fled. They had returned to their shelter in the burned-out barn to find Eleanor's old shack, the last remnant of her former life, desecrated. Painted across the door in thick, blood-red clay were two words that dripped with a primal, superstitious hatred. Witch's lover. There was no more discussion. There was no more hope of waiting or saving. To stay was to die. They gathered what little they possessed: a blanket, a small sack of flour, his gun and knife, and the worn blue dress he had bought her. Under the cover of a moonless, starless sky, they left Redemption Gap behind, heading for the dark, looming shapes of the foothills. As they climbed, the first flakes of snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering their tracks, erasing them from the world that had cast them out. They walked for hours, the cold seeping into their bones, until Luke spotted it through the swirling snow. A small, dark shape huddled against the side of a ravine. It was an old mining cabin, long abandoned, its door hanging from a single hinge. It was not much, but it was shelter. Inside, it was dark and cold, smelling of damp earth and rot. But it was a refuge from the wind and the snow. Luke managed to start a small, smoky fire in the stone hearth, while Eleanor stuffed the cracks in the walls with dried moss. The isolation was absolute. The world was reduced to the 4 crumbling walls of the cabin and the small circle of flickering firelight. In this stripped-down existence, with nothing left but each other, the pain and hardship that had defined their lives began to transform. Their shared suffering became a fierce, unspoken tenderness. They sat by the fire, sharing the last of their bread. The silence was deep and profound, filled not with tension but with a sense of shared survival. He looked at her, at the way the firelight caught the exhausted lines of her face. His hand, still scarred and rough from the fire, trembled slightly as he reached out and gently took her own. He turned her hand over, and with his thumb, he traced the faint, silvery scars on her wrist, remnants of the night her husband was murdered when the men had thrown her to the ground. He did not ask how she had gotten them. He did not need to. He knew they were a part of the story that had brought her to him. It was a quiet acknowledgement of her pain, an acceptance of every part of her. She watched him, her eyes welling with tears. Then she leaned toward him and gently, reverently, kissed the rough, puckered skin of his burned shoulder, a scar he had earned protecting her. It was her own acknowledgement, her acceptance of the pain he had taken on for her sake. In that moment, a barrier that had stood between them since the beginning finally dissolved. It was a surrender born not of passion, but of a desperate, profound need for connection, a final healing touch in a world that had offered them nothing but wounds. For the first time, they made love. It was a slow, hesitant exploration, full of an almost unbearable ache. It was an act of discovery, of learning the scarred landscapes of each other's bodies. Every touch was a question, every caress an answer. The physical pain from their old wounds, the throb in his shoulder, the tightness of her own scarred memories seemed to blend with a deeper, more sacred feeling. It was not an escape from their suffering, but an embrace of it, a consecration of the pain that had forged them into one. They were 2 broken halves of a whole, finding a fragile, fleeting peace in the shelter of each other's arms. Afterward, they lay tangled in their single blanket, the fire burning down to glowing embers. In the quiet darkness, Eleanor began to weep, silent, shuddering sobs that shook her whole body. It was not a cry of sadness, but a release of all the grief and fear and pain she had held inside for so long. Luke held her close, stroking her hair, letting her cry until the storm inside her passed. "This world," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "It doesn't forgive what it can't understand." Luke held her tighter, his lips against her temple. He looked into the dying embers of the fire, at the darkness that pressed in on all sides of their small, fragile shelter. He knew she was right. They would always be outcasts. There was no going back, but for the first time, that did not feel like a curse. It felt like a choice. "Then we'll make our own world," he answered, his voice a low, steady promise in the dark, "even if it hurts." Winter tightened its grip on the high country, burying the world under a deep and silent blanket of white. The abandoned mining cabin became their entire universe, a tiny pocket of warmth and life in a vast, frozen emptiness. Days were measured not by the sun, which was often just a pale smear behind a wall of gray clouds, but by the dwindling pile of firewood and the gnawing ache of hunger in their bellies. They survived on the lean meat of rabbits Luke managed to snare, their traps small, desperate hope set against the overwhelming indifference of the snow. They melted snow for water, drinking the cold, flat liquid from a rusty tin cup. It was a hard, spare existence, stripped down to the bone of survival, and in that crucible, they became more than lovers. They became a single entity, moving and breathing and enduring as one. The long, dark hours were a test, but also a forge. In the flickering firelight, the world outside ceased to exist, and they created their own. Luke, seeing the fear that still haunted her eyes, decided she needed to be more than a survivor. She needed to be a fighter. He took out his Colt revolver, its metal cold and heavy, and placed it in her hands. She recoiled at first, the weight of it a terrifying reminder of the violence that had shattered her life. "I don't want it," she said, her voice a whisper. "You need to know how," he insisted gently, "not to seek out trouble, but to end it if it finds you, to protect yourself, to protect us." His patience was a steady, calming force. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace her arm, how to aim down the long barrel. They used their precious few bullets for practice, setting up pine cones on a snow-covered stump. Her first shots were wild, the recoil jarring her shoulder, the sound a deafening crack in the immense silence. But she did not give up. Guided by his steady hand on her arm, his low voice in her ear, she learned. A week later, she hit a pine cone dead center from 20 paces. She looked at the shattered cone, then at the smoking gun in her hand, and a new, unfamiliar feeling took root in her, a sense of her own power. She was no longer just the woman things happened to. In return, she gave him a gift of a different kind. One evening, after their meager supper, she pulled a small, locked wooden box from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. She opened it with a small key she wore on a string around her neck. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small stack of letters. The paper yellowed and the ink faded. "My husband, Daniel, he was a learned man," she said softly, her voice thick with memory. "He tried to teach me to read and write. I wasn't a very good student." She looked at Luke, at his intelligent eyes and his hands, so capable with a gun or a tool, but clumsy with a pen. He wrote these to his brother in the East, just before he was killed. He never got to send them. She handed him a letter. He took it, turning it over in his hands. The elegant, looped script was as foreign to him as any ancient text. He could make his mark and read a few simple words like wanted or saloon. But this was a different world. "He talks about Morton," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About how Morton was trying to force him to sell the land. He made a good, fair offer for it, but Morton just laughed. Daniel wrote that he feared Morton would stop at nothing to get what he wanted." She pointed to a line of text. "There." He wrote down the name of the territorial land agent he had sent a letter to, registering his claim officially. He said the truth was on his side. This was it, the proof. Not just a grieving widow's word, but Daniel's own, a voice from the grave testifying to his innocence and Morton's greed. For the first time, Eleanor had shared the full weight of her past, and Luke felt it settle onto his own shoulders. Over the following nights, by the dim, flickering light, she taught him. She pointed out the letters, showed him how they formed sounds, how the sounds formed words. It was a slow, painstaking process. But as he began to piece the sentences together, to hear Daniel's voice in the written words, a cold, unyielding resolve hardened within him. This was not just Eleanor's fight anymore, it was his. "I have to go back," he said one night, after he had finally managed to read a full paragraph on his own. Eleanor's blood ran cold. "No," she said instantly. "Absolutely not. We have the letters. We have the truth. That is enough. We can take them with us when we go north." "It's not enough," he countered, his voice low but firm. "For 2 years, this town has called your husband a thief. They've called you cursed. They've tried to destroy you. That lie has to end. Eleanor, not in some faraway place. It has to end there, in Redemption Gap, where it began. Your name, Daniel's name, it has to be cleared." "His name is cleared in my heart, and in yours," she pleaded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "That is all that matters. They killed him. Luke, for this, for a piece of paper. They will kill you too. I would rather live with the lie for the rest of my life than live for one day without you." The argument went on for days, a painful current of fear and resolve running beneath their quiet, daily routines. But his decision was made. It was a matter of justice, a debt he felt he owed not only to her and to Daniel's memory, but to himself. He would not run from this fight. He chose a day when the snow had stopped and a weak sun had appeared in the sky. He took the letters, his pistol, and a small amount of food. He kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of fear and farewell. "I will be back," he promised. She watched him walk away down the mountainside, a lone, dark figure against the blinding white snow, until he was just a speck, and then he was gone. But she did not stay. She could not. After waiting an hour, her terror overcoming his instructions, she took the rifle he had taught her to use and followed his tracks. Luke walked into Redemption Gap like a ghost returning to his own grave. The townsfolk stared as he strode down the middle of the street, his face grim, his purpose clear. He found Silas Morton holding court on the porch of the general store, surrounded by his hired men. "Morton," Luke called out, his voice ringing out in the cold, still air. The whole street fell silent. Morton turned, a flicker of surprise followed by a smug, arrogant sneer. "Well, I thought the coyotes had gotten you by now. Callahan." "I have something that belongs to you," Luke said, pulling the packet of letters from his coat. "Or rather, something that concerns you. A letter from Daniel Whitlow. He wrote about your generous offers for his land. He wrote about your threats. He names you as a man who would stop at nothing." Morton's face paled. He saw the truth, written and damning, in another man's hand. For a moment, he was speechless. The crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning suspicion. "He also names the territorial agent who has a copy of his legal claim." Luke pressed on, his voice like stones grinding together. "The lie is over. Morton, everyone is going to know what you did." Desperation and rage contorted Morton's features. He was cornered, his power and reputation about to crumble into dust. He did what cornered animals do. He attacked. "He's lying!" Morton screamed, his voice cracking. "This man is a thief and a murderer! He came here to kill me! I'm defending myself!" Before Luke could react, before anyone could process the insane accusation, Morton drew his pistol. It was not a clumsy draw this time. It was the swift, sure movement of a man with nothing left to lose. He fired. The shot was a deafening explosion that echoed off the silent buildings. A red flower bloomed on Luke's chest. He staggered backward, a look of pure shock on his face, the letters scattering from his hand onto the snow-dusted ground. He fell to his knees, then collapsed onto his side. From the edge of town, Eleanor saw it all. A scream was ripped from her soul, a sound of such agony that it made men flinch. She did not hesitate. As Morton and his men started to advance on Luke's fallen body, she raised the rifle. She fired, not at a man, but into the wooden sign of the general store, splintering it. The crowd scattered, shouting in panic. She fired again, the bullet kicking up dirt at the feet of one of Morton's men. She was no longer a victim. She was a she-wolf defending her mate, a force of pure, protective fury. She ran to Luke, the rifle still hot in her hands. He was conscious, barely, his breathing shallow, blood soaking his coat. "Eleanor," he rasped, his eyes glazing over. "I'm here," she said, her voice choked with tears. "I have you." Under the cover of the confusion she had created, she began to drag him away, back toward the foothills. It was a dead weight, an impossible task, but she pulled with a strength born of sheer desperation. Bullets whizzed past them as Morton's men recovered and began to shoot, but their aim was wild in the panic. She managed to get him into the trees as a snow squall, sudden and violent, descended upon the town, cloaking their escape in a blinding curtain of white. She found a deep ravine sheltered by an overhang of rock and collapsed with him inside it, out of the wind and the gunfire. He was bleeding badly. She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it against the wound, but the blood soaked through it almost immediately. His skin was cold and clammy, his lips turning blue. "Leave me," he whispered, his voice a faint thread of sound. "Save yourself. Eleanor, go north." "No," she sobbed, holding his face in her hands. "We go together, or not at all. Do you hear me? Luke Callahan, we go together." He was fading, his eyes fluttering shut. She knew if they stayed there, he would die. She looked up the steep, snow-choked slope toward the cabin, a journey that had been difficult for two healthy people. For her, carrying a wounded man, it seemed impossible, but the alternative was unthinkable. She managed to get him onto her back, his arms draped over her shoulders. She grabbed his wrists, the only way she could hold him, and began to climb. Every step was an agony. The dead weight of his body threatened to pull her down. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind was a physical force, trying to rip him away from her. She whispered to him, to herself, a desperate mantra against the screaming wind. "Don't stop! Even if it hurts! Don't stop! Even if it hurts!" She fell a dozen times, her knees raw, her muscles screaming. Each time, she got up again, hauling him back onto her shoulders, and took another step. The world dissolved into a white haze of pain, cold, and sheer, stubborn will. By dawn, after a night that had lasted an eternity, she saw the dark shape of the cabin. She took 2 more steps, and her legs finally gave out. She collapsed, dragging him with her, onto the frozen ground just outside the door. He barely survived. For days, he was lost in a fevered delirium, his body burning one moment, shaking with chills the next. Eleanor fought for his life with a relentless ferocity. She packed the wound with snow to numb the pain and slow the bleeding. She kept the fire roaring, melting snow for him to drink, forcing spoonfuls of thin broth between his cracked lips. Her own hands became raw and frostbitten from handling the snow. But she did not stop. She did not sleep. She watched him, tended him, and willed him to live. On the 5th day, the fever broke. He woke to the quiet stillness of the cabin. The first thing he saw was her face. She was asleep, her head resting on his chest, right beside his wound. Her body was cold, but he could feel the faint, steady rhythm of her breathing against him. Her face was gaunt, her skin chapped and pale, her hands wrapped in crude bandages. He saw the utter exhaustion that had carved new lines around her eyes and mouth. She had given everything, had walked through the fire and the ice to bring him back. Their suffering had become a bond deeper than flesh, stronger than words. He looked at the woman sleeping on his chest, the fierce, stubborn, beautiful woman who had refused to let him die. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that even death itself could not break what they had become. The spring thaw came slowly. Then, all at once, the world, which had been a stark etching of black and white, began to bleed with color. The snow receded, revealing the damp, dark earth, and the first green shoots of new life pushed their way toward the sun. The sound of melting ice, a steady, dripping rhythm, was the sound of the world waking from a long and brutal sleep. With the changing of the seasons, a change came over Luke and Eleanor as well. The harshness of their winter survival gave way to a quiet, contemplative peace. Luke's wound began to heal, the raw, angry gash in his chest closing into a puckered, permanent scar. He would never be the same. A deep ache settled into his bones, and a pronounced limp would forever mark his stride, a physical reminder of his brush with death. One morning, when the air was warm and smelled of pine and wet soil, he helped her dig a small, shallow grave in a meadow filled with new wildflowers. They did not speak as they worked. There was no need. This was a ceremony for which there were no words. Eleanor took the small wooden box from the cabin and opened it one last time, looking at the faded ink on the yellowed pages. Daniel's letters. They were the proof of his innocence, the truth that had almost cost them everything. But they were also the last anchor to a past that had held her captive for too long. She placed the entire box into the earth. Luke, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch, helped her fill the hole, their hands mixing in the cool, damp dirt. They rolled a large, smooth white stone from a nearby creek to mark the spot. It was not a headstone, but a marker of release. They were burying the past, letting go of the ghosts, choosing to build their future on the ground of their own survival, not on the bones of old sorrows. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, the sun warm on their faces. It was finished, or so she thought. A few days later, as he practiced walking without his crutch, the grim, determined look returned to his eyes. "It's not enough," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. Eleanor's heart sank. "What do you mean? We buried it. Luke, we let it go." "We let go of the grief," he corrected her gently. "But the truth doesn't belong in the ground. It belongs to you, to your name. I left those letters scattered in the street. The town saw them. They know Morton shot an unarmed man who was only trying to speak for the dead. We cannot let that cowardice stand. We have to go back. One last time." "They will kill you," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "No," he said, turning to face her. He took her hands in his. "They won't, because this time, you'll be with me, and the truth will be with us. We are not asking for their forgiveness or their justice. We are just going to put the truth on the table and let them choke on it. Then, we walk away, for good." She saw in his eyes that his mind was made up. This was not about revenge. It was about closing the circle. It was the final act of a play that had to be seen through to its end. And he was right. She could not spend the rest of her life feeling like she had run away. They walked back into Redemption Gap not as fugitives, but as sovereign beings. They had survived the town's hatred, its violence, and the wilderness itself. They had nothing left to fear from this place. Eleanor walked beside him, her head held high, the rifle held loosely in her hands, a symbol of her new strength. Luke walked with his pronounced limp, each step a testament to what he had endured. They found Sheriff Brody in his office. Luke did not raise his voice. He simply walked in, Eleanor at his side, and laid the recovered, mud-stained letters on the sheriff's desk. A crowd, drawn by the impossible sight of their return, began to gather outside the open door. "These are the letters of Daniel Whitlow," Luke said, his voice clear and steady, carrying to the people listening in the street. "They prove he was an honest man. They prove Silas Morton threatened him for his land and then had him murdered by spreading a lie." He looked directly at the sheriff, whose face was pale. "You knew. You all knew. You let an innocent man hang, and you called his wife a curse to hide your own shame." He then turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over their familiar, frightened faces. "Morton tried to kill me for holding these letters. He shot me in the chest, right in front of all of you, and called it self-defense. You saw it. You saw I was unarmed. And you did nothing." The truth, spoken so plainly, landed with the force of a physical blow. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the street. It was not the silence of disbelief, but of profound, collective guilt. Men shuffled their feet and stared at the ground. Women who had whispered about Eleanor for years now could not meet her gaze. In that moment, they saw their own cowardice reflected in her quiet dignity, and the sight was unbearable. There was no cry for justice, no surge of righteous anger. There was only the dead, hollow air of shame. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the side of the crowd. Silas Morton, his face a mask of panicked fury, shoved his way through, vaulted onto his horse, and dug his spurs into its sides. He was fleeing. His power, built on lies and fear, had crumbled into dust at the mere speaking of the truth. Luke's eyes narrowed. This was the one thing he had not counted on. The final, violent piece of the past was trying to escape. "Stay here," he ordered Eleanor, his voice hard. Before she could protest, he limped quickly to the nearest horse, swung himself into the saddle, and galloped after Morton, the pain in his chest and leg forgotten in the heat of the chase. The pursuit led them out of town and into the labyrinth of red rock canyons that stretched for miles into the wilderness. It was a desperate, ugly chase. Luke pushed his horse, his body screaming in protest, his vision blurring with pain. He finally cornered Morton in a narrow box canyon, a dead end with walls of sheer rock on three sides. Morton spun his horse around, his face wild with hate and fear. "You should have died!" he screamed, his hand going for his gun. The gunfight was short, brutal, and without honor. It was a frantic exchange of fire between two men who were already ghosts. A bullet tore through the flesh of Luke's thigh, sending a fresh wave of agony through him. But his own aim, honed by years of survival, was true. His shot struck Morton in the shoulder, spinning him from the saddle. Morton fired again from the ground, the bullet whining past Luke's ear. Luke fired his last shot. Silas Morton shuddered, a look of surprise on his face, and then lay still. Silence descended on the canyon, broken only by the ragged sound of Luke's own breathing and the soft nickering of the horses. It was over, but there was no triumph, no feeling of victory. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness. He had taken a life. He had answered violence with violence. He slid from his horse, his legs barely able to support him, and leaned against the canyon wall, the world tilting precariously around him. He did not know how long he was there. Eventually, he managed to pull himself back into the saddle and guide the horse on a slow, agonizing journey back to town. He found Eleanor waiting for him on the road, exactly where he had left her. The entire town seemed to have vanished, the people having retreated into their homes, unable to face the consequences of the day. He half fell, half slid from the horse and collapsed into her arms. She held him, her small frame supporting his weight, her strength his only anchor. He was bleeding again, from his chest and from the new wound in his leg, his face pale and slick with sweat. She held him close, her cheek against his, feeling the tremor of pain and exhaustion that ran through his body. The cycle of pain that had begun with her husband's death had finally, terribly, come to an end. "Pain made us one," she whispered, her voice a soft, steady murmur against his ear. "Now let peace keep us." They left Redemption Gap that same day, turning their backs on it for the last time without a single look behind. They traveled south, away from the harsh winters and the bitter memories, searching not for a new life, but for a quiet one. They found it in a river valley, a green, gentle place where the water ran clear and the cottonwood trees grew tall. They built a small cabin by the water's edge, far from any town, far from the judgment of other people. Years passed. The world forgot about them. And they, in turn, forgot about the world. Their life was measured in the changing seasons, the flow of the river, the quiet rhythm of their days. He worked a small plot of land, his limp a constant companion. She planted a garden, and the scent of her flowers filled the air. They rarely spoke of the past. It was a scar they both carried, but it was a scar that had healed over, no longer an open wound. Sometimes, a traveler or a trapper, following the river, would stumble upon their small homestead. They would speak later of a quiet couple who lived in the cabin by the water. They spoke of the woman, whose eyes still held the shadow of a deep, old sorrow, but who was quick to offer a warm smile and a cup of cool water. And they spoke of the cowboy with the limp, a man of few words, whose hands were scarred but whose gaze, when it rested on his wife, was filled with a tenderness that was a story all its own. The travelers would say that the two of them would smile at each other, a silent, secret communication that seemed to speak of a shared history too deep for words, as if their pain had never been a curse, but had somehow become the very language of their love. The final image of them was one of perfect, earned peace. As dusk settled over the valley, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose, Eleanor sat on a smooth, flat rock by the river's edge. The water whispered over the stones, a gentle, endless song. Luke came and sat beside her, his work for the day done. He said nothing, simply laid his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. His hand was rough and scarred. Hers was slender and pale, but they fit together as if they had been carved from the same piece of wood. Their silence was not empty. It was filled with everything they had endured, everything they had survived. It was a silence not of sorrow, but of absolute and unbreakable peace. The quiet, profound proof that love, no matter how deeply it is scarred, endures. Thank you for listening to our story from the campfire. We would love for you to comment with where in the world you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Subscribe to our Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts with us in English.